Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, I'd like to thank you for joining today's webinar about the Trump administration's new offshore drilling plan. My name is Chris Carnevale, and I'm the Coastal Climate and Energy Manager at the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. For those of you not familiar with the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, we're a nonprofit organization that promotes responsible energy development that address the impact of global climate change and ensure clean, safe, and healthy communities throughout the Southeast. We're a membership organization, and we would like to acknowledge our members on this call and encourage those of you who are not members to please join us today. For ways in which you can become a member and get involved, please visit our website, cleanenergy.org. This webinar is part of our Southeast Coastal Climate Network webinar series. The Southeast Coastal Climate Network exists to share information and action opportunities to move the coastal Southeast to action on climate change. To this end, we have a mailing list and tools such as our webinar series. To join the Southeast Coastal Climate Network, please email me at chris@cleanenergy.org. That's chris@cleanenergy.org. Now I'd like to take a moment to review the basic functions of the WebEx control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. To ensure sound quality, all attendee lines will be muted throughout this presentation. Go ahead and find the 3 buttons along the top of your control panel. If you're having trouble hearing or seeing the slide, click the blue chat button and type in your problem so that we can help you troubleshoot. We've saved time at the end of this presentation to answer questions about today's topic. To ask a question, click the question mark button along the top of your screen. Make sure all panelists is showing up in the drop-down menu. Then type your question into the questions text box. We'll do our best to answer questions in the order that we receive them. Joining us as presenters today, we have with us Sierra Weaver from the Southern Environmental Law Center and Dr. Ingrid Biedrin and Nancy Pine from Oceana. Sierra Weaver is a senior attorney and the leader of the Coast and Wetlands team for the Southern Environmental Law Center in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Sierra has led SELC's efforts to protect the Southeast coast from offshore drilling since 2014. Sierra began her career in environmental law at SELC in 2001 after graduating from Harvard Law School and spent a decade in Washington, D.C., where she worked for Ocean Conservancy and Defenders of Wildlife. During her time in Washington, Sierra focused on marine wildlife protection and the risks and effects of offshore drilling, including extensive efforts responding to the 2010 BP Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. In 2013, she returned to SELC to focus on protecting the natural resources of North Carolina and the Southeast. Next, we'll hear from Ingrid Biedrin. She is a marine scientist and campaign manager for Oceana. Ingrid works across Oceana's U.S. campaigns, leveraging science, policy, and outreach to achieve conservation goals. Ingrid's background includes research in marine mammal acoustics, fisheries policy, ecosystem-based fisheries management, and the human dimensions of natural resource management. Her doctoral research focused on ecosystem-based fisheries management in the Mid-Atlantic and New England Fishery Management Councils. She worked at the Cornell University Bioacoustics Research Program for 6 years, studying the acoustic behavior of whales and the potential impact of human noise on whales. Ingrid holds a BA from Dartmouth College and an MS and a PhD from Cornell University. She's originally from Chelsea, Michigan. Finally, we'll hear from Nancy Pine. Nancy's been a core member of Oceana's Climate and Energy campaign since 2013 and serves as its acting director and grassroots team manager. Under Nancy's leadership, Oceana's campaign organizers build and lead coalitions of volunteers, activists, conservation partners, and business and fishing interests to stop the expansion of offshore drilling to new areas and promote the responsible development of offshore wind energy. Before coming to Oceana, Nancy served as a preservation advocate for Environment America, winning a major campaign to prevent uranium mining around the Grand Canyon, and leading other national parks and public lands conservation efforts. She also directed grassroots campaign offices in Hartford, Connecticut, working to restore the Clean Water Act and pass climate change legislation. She holds a bachelor's degree in biology and society from Cornell University, where she conducted field research in lake ecology and the biological control of invasive aquatic plants, and conducted her senior research project on offshore drilling policy leading up to and following the 2008 presidential election. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Sierra Weaver.
Hi everyone, this is Sierra Weaver from the Southern Environmental Law Center, and I get the honor of walking you through a whole lot of process. So I have to give the disclaimer and the apology up front. I am a lawyer. I have the tendency to get a little wonky, but what I'm going to try to do today is help you make sense of a lot of the noise that has been flying around on offshore drilling lately. We had an executive order, we've had secretarial orders, we've had agency director memos, we've had press conferences and press releases, and a whole lot of headlines that we really need to get to the bottom of. And I'm going to make two main points to you today. So I've got a lot of slides, but really if you walk away with two things, that's what really matters. The first is that we are at the beginning of a process. So nothing has happened yet. Know that we are just getting started here. And the second part is that it is time for local communities, local interests to really speak up and to make your voices heard at the local level, the state level, and the federal level. So a lot of time to go as this process plays out, but we are going to need everyone's voices all the way through this process. So what I'm showing you here at the very first slide is the 120 plus communities that have already passed resolutions against offshore drilling and seismic testing. We're going to hear more about that from Nancy later, but I think it's just helpful to have that visual up there of exactly the scope of the opposition to drilling and oil and gas exploration in the Atlantic. So starting out with the executive order, it was issued on April 28th, so just a couple weeks ago, and it is implementing an America First offshore energy strategy. And I pulled out just a couple of bits here that I want to make sure everyone pays attention to. The first is that the executive order calls for the agency to give full consideration to revising the 5-year plan, so the proposed oil and gas lease sales, so that it includes, quote, to the maximum extent permitted by law, annual lease sales in the Mid-Atlantic and South Atlantic. So I'm going to come back to a couple of these points, give full consideration, annual lease sales, Mid and South Atlantic, because they'll be important as we go along. That's the drilling component. As you go on, the executive order also has notes about seismic. So the second bullet here tells the agency to develop and implement, to the maximum extent permitted by law, a streamlined permitting approach for seismic research. Then we go on, there are elements of the executive order that deal with protected areas in the ocean, and there's also elements of the executive order that deal with safety and other regulations. I'm not going to deal too much with the last 2 points, but I did want to point out that just today, members of the commission that was formed to study the Deepwater Horizon disaster in 2010 issued a letter that expressed their concerns about this April 28th executive order. And they expressed a lot of concerns about the well control regulations that this executive order looks primed to roll back. That, of course, is the key safety measure put in place after the Deepwater Horizon to make sure that doesn't happen again. But it also expressed significant concerns about this overly aggressive schedule that the Trump administration seems to be pushing in terms of offshore leasing and drilling. So continuing on, I'm going to show you a couple of slides that I have borrowed from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. It's the federal agency that governs offshore drilling. And these are all slides that date back to the Obama administration, but are really helpful for what we're talking about today. So this map that I have up right here shows you what the Atlantic looks like. And in particular, it shows you the South Atlantic, the Mid-Atlantic, the North Atlantic. The Trump executive order specifically notes that they want to increase drilling to the maximum extent they can in the South Atlantic and the Mid-Atlantic. So that area really stretches from Delaware all the way down into Florida. Now, if you remember what Obama proposed to do a couple of years ago, it was not that extensive. It stretched from Virginia down to the edge of Georgia. But what Trump is proposing could be broader. You'll also notice here there is a buffer that goes along the shoreline. That was, again, part of the Obama proposal. There's no reason to believe that buffer from the coast that the Obama administration included in its proposal will appear in the Trump proposal. In fact, again, because of their command to give full consideration to expanding drilling, we think there will be no buffer, and we expect this area to be expanded as much as possible. Also important to note, the Obama proposal was for one lease sale. This will be for annual lease sales in this area. Continuing on, this is the chart that tends to make everyone glaze over, so I'm going to try to explain what's going on here. Basically, what you see are several tiers, several different layers, and this explains the offshore drilling process from the 5-year planning process to the leasing process to the exploration plan process to development and production plan. So this is the entire process from the very beginning where we are now, when you start to develop a 5-year plan, all the way through to production when you're actually drilling for oil that will be processed and sent to the pump. So what you have is a process that goes along and acts as a funnel. So an area, the southeast or the coast of North Carolina, for example, could start out at the beginning of this process included, but if it falls out anywhere along the way, it can't be put back in until the process starts back over again. So that is actually what we're seeing now, is the Obama administration made decisions to drop areas like the southeast and the mid-Atlantic out of its 5-year program. Trump administration doesn't want to be hemmed in by that decision, so they're going back to start this 5-year program over again and most likely attempt to put that area back into the mix so it can be considered as they go forward. Also important to know, if you get dropped out, you don't get put back in, so that's helpful. On the other side, the longer you stay in, the harder it is to get taken out. And one example I always like to give here is with the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. That was actually exploratory drilling that was occurring there. It was not production. So we were at the 3rd level, not the 4th level. And what my organization and several other groups tried to do is intervene with lawsuits after the Deepwater Horizon happened to stop the process, to basically get a time out so the agency would go back and look at the new science, the new information about the risks of offshore drilling. And what we found was that was really hard to make happen. Once that process gets going, it really doesn't stop. So again, funnel approach, get yourself out of there as quick as possible if you want to avoid drilling. Now, if you look at the very, very top box in the left corner of the screen, what you see is a box that says request for information. And that is the start of the entire process. So with the Trump administration saying they're going to take a new look at the 5-year plan, this is where they start. And what we know from the regulations that govern all of this is that the governors of affected states have a really important role in this process. And that this request for information stage, they're required to do 2 things. The federal agency is required to do 2 things. One is publish a notice in the Federal Register to alert stakeholders, industry, local governments, anyone who might be interested in this process that they're looking for information and you should weigh in. The other thing they have to do is they have to send a letter to the governors and ask for their input. So 2 separate processes, but closely related and both really important. At this request for information stage in the Obama administration, a number of states weighed in. You had 6 states, a lot of them on the West Coast, that specifically requested exclusion from consideration in the 5-year program. Said, we don't want drilling off our coast, don't look here for offshore leasing. You also had 9 states that requested inclusion. That, importantly, included Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia last time around. So where Obama proposed to drill were the states that asked for it. So just know that this part is coming up. We don't have the request for information out yet, but we anticipate it could be coming any day, and it's going to be really, really important for the states to weigh in. So again, if you are a local activist or someone who lives on the coast, now is the time to start speaking up to both your local government and your state government so they can weigh in on behalf of your interest. Moving to the next slide, you have the OXLA Section 18 factor. So the OXLA is the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. Section 18 is the part of the law that tells the agency what they have to consider when they decide where to lease. And so it's not enough to say we don't want leasing off our coasts. You need to say why you don't want leasing off your coast. And this tells you what reasons should be considered. So ecological characteristics are on there. Other uses of the sea and the seabed are on there. Environmental sensitivity, marine productivity are on there. So you could talk about interest in renewable energy development, interest in protecting military operations, interest in commercial and recreational fishing. All of those things would go into this balancing test that the agency undertakes. Again, the most important thing I'd like to call your attention to is the laws, goals, and policies of affected states. So that important role of the governors is included here once again. And the regs that govern offshore drilling are, again, really clear that states have the primary role here. Local governments can weigh in, but they need to weigh in with states before they go to the federal government. OCS Governors Coalition, I'm sorry, this is my mistake here. It's the coalition, not association, has been really important in this. And this is a picture of former North Carolina Governor Pat McCrory. He was the head of the OCS Governors Coalition during the Obama administration. These guys have been some of the chief cheerleaders for offshore drilling in the Southeast and Mid-Atlantic. Pat McCrory was a member, Nikki Haley was a member, Terry McAuliffe was a member last time around. And important to note there is that the governor of North Carolina has shifted over. The governor of South Carolina has shifted over. Terry McAuliffe is still in office, but there is a Virginia election coming up this fall. So you have an opportunity to speak to new players on this, and really you have an obligation to educate them about the local opposition and the concerns that local businesses, local governments, local citizens have about drilling in the Southeast. Next, I can't get away without mentioning seismic. And Ingrid's going to talk more about the science of it, but I want to hit the process of it a bit. This is, again, an Obama administration slide. This is all of the seismic tests that were pending, the applications that were pending during the Obama administration. And as you can tell, it's just a big mess. There are a bunch of seismic permits that overlap each other, areas that could potentially be blasted several times over. So this has been one of the concerns, is that air guns have these significant impacts to marine life and that they could be subject to many rounds of seismic air gun blasting. What you will find out is that obviously seismic tests happen usually before leasing occurs, so the companies can find out what is out there. What you have seen since the Trump administration's executive order came out is a renewed interest in pursuing these Atlantic surveys. So first off, these were all rejected in the Obama administration, and 6 companies appealed those rejections. So they were going through an internal administrative process when an order came out last week sending that back to the agency. So this is the memo that came out last week, resuming evaluation of air gun seismic survey permit applications. Again, this came out just last week. And basically, it restarted the process of considering seismic surveys in the Atlantic. The Obama administration had previously rejected these surveys for a number of reasons. I list some of them here. One was concern about highly endangered North Atlantic right whales. One was the fact that they had already decided they weren't going to drill in this area in the next 5-year plan. And the other reason was that technology is continuously evolving, so we can sit tight and wait for technology that's likely to cause less harm. Under this new memo that came out last week that implements the Trump executive order, BOEM is going to start reconsidering these permits again. Important to note, they still need permits. There is still process going on here, as I said before. The first thing is they need incidental harassment authorizations because these seismic surveys will cause harm to marine mammals. Once those draft authorizations are released, there will be a 30-day comment period. So again, another opportunity to raise your voice. One other thing I will note here is that a lot of the environmental analysis for seismic occurred back in 2014. And as far back as 2015, many environmental groups started raising concerns that these studies were already out of date. They already needed to be reconsidered because of increased impacts to right whales, increased numbers of marine mammals that could be harmed. So those concerns have been raised, and I think they will continue to be raised because more information has only come out since then. One more slide here. Again, just a reminder, the Deepwater Horizon disaster occurred at that exploration phase. This was not production. This was the drilling that occurs after seismic permitting occurs. So a lot of people like to say, oh, we're just going to do research. We're just going to look to see what's out there. And the truth of the matter is that doesn't really happen. Seismic testing, gives you an idea of what's out there, but it doesn't get into detail. And what the companies usually like to do after they get their leases is go out there and punch exploratory wells. So they start drilling to see how much oil they get out of there. Sometimes they get a dry well, as happened up in the Arctic when several oil companies walked away from their investments up there after seismic testing told them there was oil there. And sometimes you end up with a lot of oil, as in the Deepwater Horizon disaster. And that oil, of course, as we know, oils a heck of a lot of coastline and the entirety of the Gulf of Mexico for months at a time. So concerns about seismic and the type of risky drilling that it leads to. I'm going to turn this over to my co-panelists, but I'm just going to close with this slide. It's one of my favorites. This is one of the billboards down in the North Carolina Outer Banks that was up back during the Obama consideration of drilling. Again, it's just a reminder to speak up now, make your voice loud and clear, both on the seismic front and on the offshore leasing front, whether it's stickers or yard signs or letters to the editors or showing up at your local city council meeting. There are so many ways that folks can raise their voice and be considered as part of this process. And of course, the time to do that is now. Transferring this over to Ingrid for us to tell us more about seismic.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you everybody who's on the call today or on the webinar. The next part of this presentation, which I'm going to be giving, is talking about why we care about both offshore drilling and seismic airgun blasting from an environmental standpoint. So how do these activities affect marine life, and how could they affect the communities along the shorelines? And as Sarah was mentioning when she showed you the other map, the areas under review for both drilling, offshore drilling, and seismic span from roughly Delaware down to Florida. So this is a huge geographic area. And there are actually 6 permit applications that are being reviewed for seismic at this point. And just to clarify, I'm going to be talking about impacts to marine life from the seismic airgun exploration, but when I'm talking about that, we also want to be thinking about the impacts from offshore drilling. And we all saw what happened after the BP oil spill. We know that when we drill, there's going to be spills, and we know that if there are oil spills, that all of the wildlife along the eastern seaboard would be impacted. And one concern we have about these seismic airgun explorations are that there could be up to 6 happening at one time. And so not only would there be really loud noises from one survey happening, but there could be multiple surveys happening all at the same time. Now I just want to step back for a minute and ask, or answer your question, which might be, what is seismic airgun blasting? And airgun blasting it's a process used to look for oil and gas resources beneath the seafloor. So companies that are considering buying leases for offshore drilling first want to understand what resources could be there. And this little diagram here shows you a rough idea of what happens. So there's a big ship, maybe a 200-foot long ship that tows these seismic air guns, and these air guns shoot these loud blasts of air through the water column. And then the sound from the blast travels through the water, down into the ocean floor, bounces off whatever sort of resources are down there, and goes back up to the surface to be recorded by the speakers being towed along the surface. And scientists can tell from those reflections generally what kind of resources are under the seafloor. Here's a picture of a survey ship towing the air guns. You can see the bubbles and the water behind the ship. That's what it looks like when the blasting is happening. This picture in the lower left-hand corner here shows the actual track lines of a ship doing seismic airgun surveys. So the ship goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And this can continue for days, weeks, even months at a time. And there's a blast repeated every 10 to 12 seconds. So think about if you were in your home eating dinner and there was a jackhammer outside going off all day, all night for months at a time. That's what these animals are going to be experiencing. Again, these sounds are extremely loud. They are one of the loudest human-made sounds in the oceans, and they're equivalent to what it'd be like if there were dynamite being blasted underwater. And these sounds are so loud that they can travel up to 2,500 miles, so that's farther than a flight from New York City to LA. And because sound travels so efficiently underwater, any sort of noise can be amplified and, again, have huge impacts. Here's a picture of an array of air guns. There's a single air gun here in the lower right-hand corner. And here's a view of what an array looks like. So you have a ship, and then it's pulling a whole array of air guns. One vessel can carry up to 96 air guns. So the largest arrays can span an area more than 3.5 times the area of Central Park. And that's just the size of the array, and then the sounds themselves can travel, again, hundreds or even thousands of miles. As you'd expect, if you have this amount of noise being blasted underwater, that's going to have a huge impact to marine life. And there is a lot of scientific research that shows that seismic airgun noise does impact marine life. And this includes whales, fish, turtles, even invertebrates like oysters and clams. So why is sound important to the oceans? Why do we care if these animals are actually have this sound coming at them? Well, we know that animals use sound for communication, navigation. Some whales are migrating along the coast. They need to use sound to migrate, to find prey, to keep track of babies, to find mates. These sounds are used for behaviors that are necessary for survival. And as I said, air guns are one of the loudest human-made sounds in the ocean, so we need to be paying attention to how these noises are going to impact life. Now, I know you can't read all the fine print on this map, but what this map shows is that there are many important habitat areas for wildlife off the East Coast. All the different colors represent habitats that are either designated as critical for endangered species or essential habitat for fish. And there are also endangered sea turtles here. So as you can see, the Atlantic Ocean off the eastern coast of the United States is an important area for marine ecosystems. So now we'll talk a little bit more specifically about how sound can hurt each of these different types of animals. The North Atlantic right whale, which many of you might have heard of, is one of the most endangered whales in the whole world. There are only about 500 remaining, and their only known calving ground, so the only place we know that they go to have their babies, is in this red area here on the map, and that area spans Georgia and Florida. And that area is squarely within the area proposed for both offshore drilling and seismic airgun exploration. And it's a huge concern that many scientists and conservationists and citizens are worried about. One other thing to note is that this population of right whales is so endangered that if only 1 or 2 whales are killed, or 1 or 2 calves are, don't survive per year, that could be enough to tip the population towards extinction. So any sort of human activity, especially seismic airgun blasting and offshore drilling, is a huge threat to this population's survival. As I mentioned, there's tons of scientific research that shows that whales and other wildlife respond to seismic airgun noise. So just a few examples of what happens when seismic airgun noise, when whales are exposed to seismic airgun noise. These animals can be displaced and leave important habitat areas. Communication used for things like mating and feeding can be disrupted. Communications between animals can be covered up. For example, imagine if you're standing next to somebody having a conversation and you're next to a highway and a big truck goes by. That's an example of how you can be talking and then not hear each other if there's too much noise. So communications can be interrupted, and also there are physiological impacts. So we know that stress levels and some hormone levels go up when the oceans are louder, and then there can also be physical damages if the sounds are close enough to the animal. So there can actually be loss of hearing. In some other species of whales, we know feeding rates have declined in sperm whales. For example, the sounds they use to find squid, their echolocation is actually interrupted. Fin whales have abandoned important habitat and changed their singing patterns. And bowhead whales have actually changed their breathing patterns and even stopped calling altogether. Now moving on to impacts on fish. We know that seismic noise impacts both commercially and recreationally important species of fish. And this means that fishermen, people who like to go out on their boats and fish for the day, or people who rely on fishing for their living, seismic surveys and any sort of spill could actually disrupt their business and interrupt their ability to fish. One study shows that there's a 40 to 80% reduced catch rate in commercial fish during seismic surveys. Also, fish like herring and blue whiting leave their habitat, and there can be alarm responses and actually damage to hearing in commercially important species like cod and pollock, and then there can actually be damage to some species of fish from seismic noise. So here's another reason why communities along the eastern coast should be concerned. Not only are wildlife being threatened with extinction, as in the case of the right whales, but actually economies and local communities and their recreation could be interrupted. Moving on to invertebrates, you might ask, why do we care if invertebrates are impacted by seismic noise? But invertebrates include a vast array of species and animals, and so animals like oysters, clams, mussels, crabs, animals that a lot of us like to eat or that are important to the economy can be impacted by seismic. There have actually been startle responses, stress responses, and even developmental delays in larvae when seismic noise is happening around invertebrates. And finally, seismic noise has been shown to cause responses in sea turtles. All of the sea turtle species along the East Coast are endangered. Specifically, the loggerhead turtle has critical habitat that's within the blast zone and within the area that could be affected by a spill. So we've seen turtles can actually have alarm responses avoid important habitat. And the reason we care about avoidance is that there are beaches and areas where loggerheads come to nest every year. And if they're driven away from those beaches and don't have a chance to lay their eggs, that can have direct impacts to the actual survival of their populations. And then finally, there is a potential risk for entanglement in the actual survey equipment. So you saw how there were the ships pulling the seismic survey, seismic air guns. There's the possibility that turtles could actually be entangled in those lines. And then this last slide, don't worry about reading all the details, but it's an example of one more recent piece of science that shows from a scientific perspective that yes, there's a huge amount of science that shows that seismic airgun noise does impact whales, fish, invertebrates, and turtles. So if and when seismic surveys and offshore drilling are approved, there's a lot of evidence to show that animals will be put at risk and that it's not a wise decision for the environment or the communities that depend on that environment. And that's all I have, so I will pass it along to Nancy.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nancy Pine, and I direct Oceana's Climate and Energy Program. Oh, it seems like I accidentally started video. Sorry about that. There we go. Nope. Chris, fix this for me. Okay. Hopefully I stopped that. Anywho, apologies. So again, I'm Nancy Pine, and I direct Oceana's Climate and Energy Campaign in Washington, D.C., and that includes the team of campaign organizers who worked with many of you to stop offshore drilling and seismic airgun blasting in the Atlantic. So now that my colleagues have depressed you, I get to do the fun part and tell you why I'm actually quite optimistic. And not only am I optimistic, but I see all of these hurdles that have been thrown at us by the new administration as an opportunity. So I want to start just by saying that we have fought this before and we won. And we'll do it again because this time a lot more folks are fired up and they're paying attention to what's happening in Washington. Protecting our coasts from offshore drilling, it's proven to be a unifying issue that has allowed us to build non-traditional partnerships and alliances across the political spectrum. And President Trump's executive order has made it clear that all coasts are back on the table, which means that's more people and more communities to organize in. So I have the privilege of telling you the story behind the grassroots movement that protected the Atlantic coast. And from my perspective, there were three main pieces that allowed us to achieve victory. The first one was coastal residents and activists who worked at the local level to get their town and city councils to pass resolutions opposing offshore drilling and seismic airgun blasting for oil and gas. The second was the business and fishing community really came together and came out in opposition to these activities. And third, we have a strong regional coalition represented by many of the groups on this call that are committed to working together to make sure that elected officials in Washington and in state capitals were aware of the opposition to Atlantic drilling and seismic airgun blasting. I will be honest, though, at the onset of the campaign, our political outlook was pretty bleak. It might not be quite the same as it is these days, but the odds were definitely stacked against us when we started working on this. We were looking at a political landscape where the governors in the Southeast were staunchly pro-oil, and as Sierra mentioned, that's the governors from Virginia South all wanted oil and gas development off their shores. We had members of Congress and senators that were essentially bought and paid for by the oil industry. And at the time, the administration was really looking to show that they were keen to develop an all-of-the-above energy portfolio. So we face this timeless problem of how do you counter money and power? And we knew that the answer was in grassroots organizing. So we had a theory that despite the fact that our elected officials in DC and in the state capitals in East Coast states were in favor of offshore drilling and exploration, our theory was that coastal residents, regardless of political affiliation, would largely not be supportive of turning their beach towns into oil towns and sacrificing their thriving tourism and fishing-based industries for some, false promises from the oil industry. So we had this theory, but we did struggle for a few years just trying to gain traction and trying to figure out how to get folks engaged, because at the time people were not paying attention like they are right now. So I'm going to tell a quick story, and some of you on the phone may know it very well, but back in 2014, actually right at the end of 2013, but just around January, the turn of the new year, our organizer, Randy, was working with a local chapter leader for the Surf Runner Foundation of the Cape Fear chapter of North Carolina. The two of them got word that a small town called Curie Beach, North Carolina, it's southeast coast of North Carolina. He had written, he'd signed a letter written by the American Petroleum Institute, which is the lobbying arm of the oil industry, and he had signed it on town letterhead showing his support for seismic airgun blasting and offshore drilling off the coast of North Carolina. Well, he did that without consulting his colleagues, and he did that without consulting his constituents. So Randy and Ethan got together and they started telling people about this. They did good old-fashioned door knocking, sending emails, talking on social media, letting people know that the mayor had taken this position without the support of his community. And this is a town, sleepy town, maybe 1,000 year-round residents. Normally a handful of folks go to the monthly town council meetings, but at the town council meeting at the end of January 2014, over 300 people showed up to protest the mayor's position. And person after person get up, take the microphone and say, Mayor, you can have your position on offshore drilling or seismic blasting, but when you speak for Curie Beach, you're speaking for us, and we disagree with you. There were two people who spoke out in favor of oil and gas exploration, and you guessed it, both of them were paid by the oil industry and shipped in from out of town. So at this council meeting, where people were lined up, filled the room, out in the hallway, out in the parking lot, one of the audience members was the mayor of the next town up in Carolina Beach, and he saw the writing on the wall. He didn't want a similar mutiny in his community, and he went back to his council, and they passed the first modern resolution from Carolina Beach opposing seismic airgun blasting for oil and gas off of North Carolina. We looked at that with our organizing team and empowered our volunteers to try and replicate that. And we were successful. We got some resolutions passed in New Jersey, some in Florida, several more in North Carolina. But we knew that we were not going to be able to do it alone with our small team, and that we were going to have to create a broad coalition of allies in order to scale up for the kind of opposition it was going to take to win. So we worked with state groups to host our first offshore drilling coalition meeting in person in Charleston, where we really shared insights as conservation partners and made plans, really concrete plans to work together. Then Oceana hired two more campaign organizers, one right there in Charleston, a local named Samantha, and one in Northeast Florida, who many of you work with, called Erin. So we really focused in on building our statewide coalitions and regional coalitions, and with our combined volunteers and combined activists in East Coast states, we were able to see the exponential growth of these coastal resolutions. And we got to the point where we had this great story of opposition to offshore drilling and seismic blasting in coastal states, and particularly in the Carolinas. we crossed state lines. We, didn't have someone in Georgia, but we had allies in Georgia and were able to replicate that way. We got to the point where 100% of the coast, or 100% of the municipalities in coastal South Carolina were lined up in opposition to offshore drilling. And Representative Sanford, who is the congressman for the 7th, or maybe it's 1st, I always forget, but he's the representative for the Charleston area. He actually held a press conference with the mayors of these coastal communities and announced that he was switching his position to oppose seismic airgun blasting and offshore drilling. And he has become the champion against these activities in Congress. Spoiler, but fast forward to today, we are at 123 municipalities and counting, and that represents 90% of coastal communities in that blast zone that Ingrid showed of the area from Cape Canaveral, New Jersey, from Cape May, New Jersey to Cape Canaveral, Florida. Communities lined up in opposition to offshore drilling activities. But we were starting to hit a wall. There was clearly opposition in the states, and the state media was really covering this, and congressmen were changing their position. But we weren't breaking through to Washington, D.C. So we focused again as a coalition to really meeting with folks in the administration and meeting with members of Congress, bringing them a physical binder of all of the resolutions, the letters, the editorials from either their state, or if they were in the administration, we brought them the whole list of things. And we actually have categorized all of this on a website called stopthedrills.org. So I invite you all to check that out after the webinar ends. So we had all these meetings, and then we got together as a regional coalition for the first time, and committed to doing a series of rapid-fire events together. This image that Sierra put up for her first slide, that is a beautiful graphic that their team at Southern Environmental Law Center created, showing all of the coastal communities that oppose offshore drilling activities. We placed that in a lot of what we call hill rags in DC to make sure decision makers were seeing this image in the papers that they're reading. We hosted a series of lobby days. Both Oceana did, Surfrider did, a number of coalition partners did. And then fast forward to March 2016, we had this major victory. The federal government cited strong local opposition, conflicting uses like military conflicts, and weak market incentives, and the administration officially removed the Atlantic Ocean from consideration from offshore drilling. We were ecstatic, but we knew that the job wasn't done. We needed to see it through to the end and defeat seismic airgun blasting, because we don't want them exploring for all of the reasons that Ingrid mentioned in her slides. It is very dangerous to marine wildlife and the coastal communities that depend on marine life. And not only that, but we don't want offshore drilling, so why would we risk all of it for seismic blasting? So we stuck together. We kept the band together, so to speak. We put a premium on working with our volunteers in the business community and getting business and fishing interests to weigh in against seismic airgun blasting. So that by January of 2017, the Obama administration rejected all of the seismic airgun blasting permits. So here we are today. We came together a few months ago, recognizing that we had major successes under our belts, but we had a very different reality in Washington, and we were going to have to stay together and work together if we wanted to defend those victories. But we're ready. We're ready to fight. We know we have the winning recipe, and our coalition is committed to working together. We share intelligence. We leverage organizational strengths, and we worked with some incredibly dedicated, smart, and passionate volunteers and allies. So in closing, I want to say bring it on, Mr. Trump, because it does not matter who is in office. Coastal communities and the businesses that rely on healthy oceans do not want offshore drilling or seismic airgun blasting off their coasts. They said no before, they'll say no again and again and again. So I hope that I will see you all on Saturday at a beach near you as we mark the 7th annual Hands Across the Sand, where activists and beachgoers will join hands at, I think we're closing in on 100 locations around the U.S. and the world, and we'll draw a symbolic line in the sand where we'll say no to offshore drilling and yes to clean energy. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Nancy and Ingrid and Sierra, for these great presentations and the great information. We're going to transition now into Q&A until 3 o'clock. And just as a reminder for folks, if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will try to get through as many questions as we can in the next few minutes. So our first question is about the timeline of the upcoming 5-year program. What is the timeline like for that, and you know, when can we expect to see some of those steps in the flow chart that Sierra showed? When can we expect to see some of those roll out?
Yeah, this is Sierra. You know, we really don't know when the Trump administration is going to put out that request for information to get things rolling. They did say that they would have a report on their progress in terms of restarting the 5-year plan by May 22nd, I believe is the date. So maybe we're going to see something really soon. Maybe they're just going to issue their report and say something's coming. But that request for information can be, you know, a half-page just announcement saying we're opening up this process, we want input from everybody. So that can actually get started really quickly, and we expect that it probably will. When that comes out, there's a 45-day comment period, so you have your time to weigh in. After that, there's a draft proposed program. There's a 60-day comment period on that. After that, there's a proposed program. There's a 90-day comment on that. So there are opportunities to weigh in, but as I said before, the important thing is to use that funnel approach and get any areas that you care about being protected for drilling out as soon as possible. Once they're out, they are protected and won't come back in. So I would say expect that it's going to start pretty quick and be ready to weigh in, focusing on the governors first.
Awesome. And Nancy or Ingrid, do you want to add on to that?
I think Sierra's answer is great.
Okay. Now we have a follow-up question, which is kind of the parallel track of, there's the 5-year program, which is going to focus on the offshore drilling, the leasing for offshore drilling, and then the parallel track, which is happening simultaneously but through a separate process, is the seismic exploration track. So we have a question about any upcoming dates or deadlines that have been published relevant to granting exploratory, basically seismic exploration permits. Are there any dates or timelines that we've heard about that?
Yeah, this is Sierra again. Nothing has been published yet. There are no proposals that are out for public comment at this time. However, once it is released, it's a 30-day public comment period, so that's actually really quick. And that will be on the incidental harassment authorizations, excuse me. It's a bit of a mouthful, but that's the permits to harass marine mammals. So in their previous studies, the federal agencies found that over 130,000 marine mammals would be injured by seismic blasting. So this is a permit that is essential, and they really can't go forward and cause that type of harm to marine mammals until they go through that permitting process. So that will be another opportunity for people to weigh in, and we encourage people to weigh in as soon as that is ripe for participation.
Yes, and this is Ingrid. Just one more comment on those IHAs, or incidental harassment authorizations. Those IHAs would allow marine mammals to be negatively impacted by the seismic surveys, and as I showed, there's lots and lots of science that shows that seismic can disrupt communication that's essential for survival for these marine mammals. So we know that there are lots of reasons these should not be approved, and we're hoping that anyone who has an interest in keeping seismic from happening does participate in that comment period, and really emphasizes the fact that there's lots of science out there that shows that these seismic surveys are a bad idea.
Great. Okay. We have a number of questions coming in. If you have a question, please go ahead and type it into the question box on the right-hand side of the screen. I have a number that I can answer pretty quickly, and then I'll kick it over to the panelists for adding on any additional comments. But one person asks if we have any maps to overlay offshore wind potential leases with the oil areas. Just real quickly, I don't have a particular map that shows that. There is a government website you can look at called the marinecadastre.gov, I think. But essentially, offshore wind is closer to shore. The offshore drilling, the leasing sites that have been proposed are at least 50 miles offshore. It's hard to say whether the Trump proposal will be the same, but the last proposal we saw was 50 miles offshore and outward. Offshore wind is closer into shore than that. So there's no direct competition between the two. Seismic is a different issue. There is seismic that's been proposed right up to basically 3 miles offshore. So that's a different thing. And then let's see, another question. Shouldn't the export of U.S. oil and gas be used to undermine the justification for energy independence and the need for drilling? And very quickly, yes, that is absolutely correct. And then another quick one like that, job creation is often used as a misleading rationale for fossil fuel development. Shouldn't we be touting the virtues of jobs created by clean energy rather than fossil fuels? And again, the answer to that is yes. So panelists, do you want to add on anything to distance offshore, jobs created, or energy independence and exports?
Yeah, this is Sierra. I'll just say on the jobs front, I believe Oceana put out a report on wind jobs, renewable energy jobs versus offshore oil jobs, and Southern Environmental Law Center actually worked with a group called the Center for the Blue Economy to talk about the jobs that already exist in these areas, the really thriving tourism industry that would be put at risk by drilling. So absolutely, the oil industry numbers on jobs are always inflated, and they really don't get to either the trade-offs that could be made for renewable energy jobs or the trade-offs that will have to be made in terms of folks who are already relying on these areas for coastal tourism jobs, coastal fishing jobs, whether it's recreational or fishermen. These areas we know all along the southeast coast, have a thriving economy, and offshore oil is not part of it.
Great. Okay. Well, it's 3 o'clock now, so we're going to have to wrap up. I'll do one or two more questions, but just to respect everyone's time, we'll have to wrap up. One person gives a comment and says that it would be really handy if we could let everybody know when some of these documents are made public in the Federal Register and that kind of thing. So I'll go ahead and say that FACE will absolutely be contacting people when comment periods are open. And I'm sure, I can't speak for the other groups on the line, but I would imagine, there will be some amount of that too. So if you're not already, please sign up for the mailing list of FACE, that's cleanenergy.org, of Oceana, that's oceana.org, and Southern Environmental Law Center, that's southernenvironment.org. Is it southernenvironment.org, Sierra?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. So please go ahead and sign up for notices from us, and we will absolutely let you know when it's time for comment period. So let's end on this last question, which is just essentially, what do people need to do between now and that first comment period opening, either for the request for information or the incidental harassment authorization? What can people be doing now to lay the groundwork?
So this is Sierra. Oh, go ahead, Nancy.
I would say pick up the phone. Make 2 phone calls. Make 3 phone calls. Call your member of Congress. Tell them you oppose offshore drilling and seismic airgun blasting, and you expect them to as well. Call your governor. Sierra made it very clear how important governors will be in the this next round of the fight. And call your senators. They need to hear from you, and they need to know you oppose these activities and expect them to as well.
One other thing I will add, if you go to www.protectourcoastnow.com, you can order stickers that are anti-offshore oil drilling. You can order yard signs that are anti-offshore drilling. And the sort of local community sentiment became a really big part of the story last year. You had reporters from outside the area going into these towns and just being blown away by the visual images of how many people were speaking up. So I'd say, like Nancy said, pick up your phone, make your voice heard, but also make your voice seen through those stickers and yard signs. Go to that website, protectourcoastnow.com, and get yours.
Great. Well, thank you everyone again for joining our webinar today and for your thoughtful questions. Today's presentation has been recorded and it will be available on the webinar archive page of cleanenergy.org. We will also send you a link to that recording once it's been processed. If you enjoyed today's presentation, please consider joining SACE so that we can continue to work towards clean energy solutions for the Southeast. Visit cleanenergy.org for info on how to join and become involved. Thank you everyone again, and thank you to the panelists. Go have a great day. Bye.
Thanks, Chris.